Hey guys, how you going? My name is Dom, and in today's video we're going to be having a look at validating and structuring your JSON objects over WebSockets. Okay, so what I mean by validating and structuring is essentially we're going to be going over a couple of techniques for sending JSON from the client side to the WebSockets server, or vice versa. In a structured format that makes sense for your application. Okay, so this overall, makes your code easier to maintain and expand upon, and overall it improves the stability of your application. Okay, so I want to sort of go a bit more into what I meant by having a structure, and that is to essentially have things like, for example, let's just say that your client side here moves the mouse, and you want to send your mouse movement to the server side. You want to send that movement in like a sort of package which says, for example, the type of this event is mouse movement, and then you can send some data like the X and Y of the mouse, things like that. Or another example might be in a chat application, an event type could be an actual chat message being sent across where you have the content of the message, maybe who sent it, something like that. So that is what I mean by validating and structuring your JSON. So let's jump right into an example. Hey guys, how you going? My name is Dom, and I forgot to mention in today's video that one of the other main reasons to validate the JSON coming to your WebSockets server is because we can't trust the client. Technically, the client side can send through whatever data they want. Any sort of malicious user trying to experiment with the application can send through whatever data they want. So we need to make sure we actually validate that JSON before trying to process it. Another reason might be because let's just say your client-side JavaScript is running on an older version, or at least the client has an older version of your JS. Well, the older version shouldn't break the server side. So that is why we need to validate and structure our JSON before trying to use it. That's all. Let's continue with the rest of the tutorial. Okay, so right here on this index.html file, it looks something like this inside the text editor. As we can see, I've connected to a WebSockets server on port 8082, and I've just got inside here. Once we connect, I've got this event listener. Okay, and then inside this directory here, I have this index.js file which represents our WebSockets server. As we can see, I'm simply just starting a WebSocket server on the same port 8082, and this has come from my previous two videos on WebSockets. So if you're not too sure what this syntax is, then please have a look at those videos before watching this one. But essentially, as we can see right here, once we have a WebSocket connection, I'm simply saying new client connected, and inside here, I'm logging out each message that gets sent by the client. Okay, so let's just start up this server. I'm inside the server directory, so I can say node index.js, and of course now it is started. If I was to go back inside the index.html, I'm just going to go down here and send some JSON to the server side. So I'm going to say ws.send within here, and I'm going to be sending through here json.stringify and pass through here, for example, let's just say I'm sending through some data about a player that is moving on a game board. So I can say here x 250 and y 160, for example. Okay, so if I was to save this here and refresh the browser, we can see in the console of the server, it has outputted our JSON string. Okay, so let's format this JSON in a particular way, that allows us to deal with it easier on the server side. Okay, so like I said earlier, this right here is representing some sort of player movement inside a game. So let's actually tag this object right here with the actual type of event that it actually is. So let's go inside here and say, let's just put down here event, okay, as a property. So for the event property, I'm going to say, let's just do player movement. Okay, so now when of course this gets sent to the server side, it's going to be flagged with this event right here. And this will tell the server side, or at least tell you, the developer, what sort of information you expect to see inside this actual object. Okay, so now you know this X and Y relates to player movement. And then of course you can deal with this type of event in its own way. Okay, so let's add one more here. That is going to be payload, and payload is going to contain your actual data. So let's pass through here an object and say X and Y just like that. Okay, so now essentially this one here is going to define our structure for each package of data we are sending to the server side. Now of course you could follow the exact same structure for the client side. It can really go both ways, it's totally up to you. But now, as we can see, of course, the server is going to receive this right here, and for the remainder of this mini application, all we're going to be sending to the server side is data, which looks like this. It's got the event and the payload property, nothing more. Okay, so this right here is just one of many different techniques. I just thought of this myself. There are many techniques online that, sort of outline how you can, structure your data. I've seen as well before, instead of sending through event and payload, you might want to instead send through something like this, where you basically, where you pass through an array, just like this, and then you can, make it so the first element in the array is the type of event, and then the second one will be your actual data. There are many different ways to do this, but the general idea is you flag the data with a particular type and then deal with the actual information accordingly. Okay, so let's just save this right here and then go back in the browser. I'll refresh, and of course now the server side receives something like this. So now the main chunk of this is going to be going on the server side and actually, dealing with this kind of format, validating it, making sure the data is correct, and then of course actually doing the work or reacting to the event. Okay, so let's just go inside the index.js, and I'll just get rid of this terminal window just for now so we can see a bit more of what's actually going on. So the way I want to do this is we're going to be using a package called yup. And yup allows you to define basically just object schemas. So for example, using yup, you could say that you expect this object right here being sent from the server side, being sent from the client side. You can say you expect that object to be in a certain structure. You expect an event property, a payload property, an X and a Y. This needs to be integer. It needs to be there itself, and it's a required field. Same goes for the Y, etc. So you can define rules for an object, and then once you know that the object is in the right structure, you can then work with it accordingly. So let's go inside here and then go inside the server directory and let's install the yup package. So I can say npm I and then yup, just like this. And of course now it is going to install that package. Okay, so now I can just require yup right up here. Okay, so const yup is equal to require, then pass through here yup. Okay, so now let's define a couple of schemas for our data. Okay, so when I talk about schemas, I'm referring to this this object right here. So we're going to be defining a couple of, or at least one in this video, a data structure for this particular event. So let's go down here and say, let's just do const yup event schemas. So I'm having trouble typing that word, but yup event schemas is equal to an object right here. We're going to be using a string and then a yup schema as the actual value. So we can say here, for example, player underscore movement. Okay, so for the player movement event, we can say this. We can say yup dot object, okay, and then dot shape, and then we can pass through here each one of our fields. So, obviously, if you haven't used the Yup package before, you're not going to be too sure of the syntax, but I'll leave the documentation for Yup below, but it's quite straightforward and easy to understand. So, inside shape, we can put something like this. We can say, okay, for shape, we can say X, just like that, and we can say yup.number.required.integer. Okay, so we are saying with this schema, we want X to be present. Okay, so required, it's got to be a number, and that number has to be an integer. It can't be a float or whatever. So it's a required integer as the X. Okay, if I was to send through, for example, X and say dcode as string, this right here is going to fail to validate once we get to validation very shortly. Okay, so we're just saying here, we want X to be a required integer. Okay, so let's do the same thing for Y. So something like this. Y, same thing, yup, number, required integer. Okay, so now we can essentially just keep this right here, and we can just put a comment, and we can just say, something like, collection of yup schemas for each event type. Now right here, I'm obviously putting this inside the global index.js file for simplicity. However, you may decide to actually put all of this stuff inside a separate class or file to help with organization. And then inside here, we can just define a type for this constant. So we can say type using JSDoc, and we can just say right here, object dot and then string and then yup dot schema. So now, in certain text editors like Visual Studio Code, we should now get type completion for when we actually use this object. Okay, so we're just saying here it's a string as the key, and then the object or the actual value is going to be a yup schema. So yup schema right here, and of course string as the key. Okay, so now we've defined our yup event schemas, we can move on to actually validating an incoming message. Okay, or at least parsing it. So let's go down here, and we're going to be defining a new function, and this function is going to be taking in our message that is sent from the client side. It is going to then parse it as JSON. Once it's got the JSON, or once it's parsed from JSON to a JavaScript object, we can then validate each one of those keys. Okay, so let's go down here and say function parse message. Okay, I'm going to pass through here, of course, a single parameter, that being the message right there, which is going to come from this message right here directly. Okay, we can say here, const object is equal to json.parse, and pass through here our message. Okay, and now we are going to go down here, and we're going to be saying something like this. We're going to say if not event in object, okay, then we're going to be throwing an error. So we're basically saying we're going to try and parse our message. So of course this one right here, this entire object, we're going to try and parse this, and then we're going to say, you know what, we need to have the event property inside the object in order to proceed. So if it is not there, then we're going to simply throw an error message. So we can say throw new error, and we can say, event property not provided, something like that. Okay, and we can do the exact same thing for the payload. So go down here, and we can say payload, and pass through here payload. So I might have forgot to mention that the usage of the word payload just refers to the actual data which is relevant. So this is sort of like our own little data format. So we're saying this is the event type, and this payload is the actual data which is important to us, which we're actually going to use. Okay, so for the payload, of course, it needs to be required. in order to proceed. So maybe in your own application the payload isn't actually required. Let's just say it's sort of like let's just say your event might be something simple like a simple ping or a simple sort of something to say I'm still alive, something like that. Maybe the payload is not required, but in my example I'm just going to make it required for simplicity. Okay, so right here we've checked both the event and the payload property. We can now move on to actually validating our payload, okay, based on one of our event schemas. Okay, so let's go down here, and we're going to be saying, you know what? Actually, I might just stop there and actually try and get this to work before proceeding. So let's just return the object just for now. So the parse message is going to take our message, it's going to validate it, and then return the parsed object. Okay, so we're just going to go up here and put a quick js.comment. I'll just copy this from a previous example, so I'll copy this right here and paste it inside here. So we're just saying it's going to validate and parse an incoming message to ensure it is in the form of JSON and the schema is okay. And we can see right here we're going to be taking in a message which most likely is going to be a string, so I may as well change this to be string. Okay, but in the case you send through something other than in the case that you send through something other than a string, it's not going to be the case, but let's just do string for simplicity. Okay, and we can see here, of course, it is going to return this format right here. It's going to be returning an object with a event property containing a string and the payload containing the actual object. So essentially, it's going to be returning the exact same information as we sent through right here. Okay, so it's also going to throw if there was some sort of error in the schema validation or something up here, or even the JSON parsing. Okay, so hope that makes sense. Let's go down here now and actually use that method or that function. Okay, so let's make a new constant right here. Let's call this. Actually, you know what? Let's make this a let. So we're going to say let data. Okay, so let's make let data have no value just yet, and then let's go down here and use a try catch. So we can say try. Okay, we're going to say data is equal to parse message, and we're going to take through here the actual message, just like that. Okay, so now of course if this particular function throws in any of these cases, then we can just say catch, get the error object, or let's make this ERR, okay, and we can say right here something like console.log and then invalid message and pass through here e.message, something like that, and then we can simply just return an early exit out of this function. So basically we are safe. The server side is not going to crash if the message being sent is invalid, and we should be good to go. Okay, so now we can just say something like, console.log. We can log out the actual data. So of course, if everything goes well, data is going to contain this right here. Now this looks, this may look overly complicated, but unfortunately or fortunately, it is what is required in order to make sure that the application, receives the correct data, and to make sure we can actually move on with dealing with each one of our events. Okay, so let's just save this and then run the application or run the server side. Okay, and we can just go back inside the web browser. We're going to refresh. And hopefully we should see in the console our message right there. So we get our JSON object. If I was to go inside here, index.html, and say, for example, event s, so events instead of event. Okay, let's try this, save and refresh. And now inside here we get right here, we get an error. So let's just go back inside here. Going to be making this ERR instead. Okay, let's just try it again. That's my mistake. I'll run the server and then refresh once again using events as our property right there, and we can see we get here invalid message, event property is not provided. So of course we didn't actually provide the correct property right here. So we have validated and we have parsed our JSON in terms of the events and our payload property. So now we can move on to using yup to actually validate the object right here. Okay, so let's go back inside here, and inside the function, we're going to be saying this right here. It's a simple one-liner. We're going to say object.payload is equal to yup event schemas at the property of object.event. Okay, so for example, in this case right here, we are saying, you know, player movement, like that. Okay, so yup event scheme is at player movement, or of course, object.event. Okay, so yup event scheme is object.event. We're going to be saying dot validate. Dot validate sync. Okay, then pass through here object.payload. So basically, the validate sync method of the yup package is going to throw an error if the actual object right here is not in the correct format, or one of these is invalid. Okay, so for example, if I was to send through here, you know, dcode as a string instead of a number, then this right here is going to throw, and then of course we're going to catch it inside here. If all is well, this method is going to return the object which it has validated. So basically the payload is going to stay the same. Okay, so now, with all that being said, and like I said earlier, I'll link the documentation to yup below if you want more information on how this method works, but like I said, it's going to throw if there was any problems. So now object.payload is going to be reassigned, and we're going to return it right here. So let's try it again. Let's run the server side. Okay, then go in the browser, refresh, and we're still going to get the event property not provided. So let's go back inside here and make this back to event, and then try again. Okay, as we can see here, we get the object working perfectly fine. So now of course we can deal with the actual object and move on. However, if I was to go inside here now and say, for example, dcode as my message, or as my x property, let's refresh. This time in the console we get invalid message, x must be a number type, but the final value was none. Okay, so we can see there the yup package has essentially given us that message. Of course, our x property is not a integer. Okay, so you can of course customize this to include whatever you like. Let's say, for example, you've got a description as well that is required. You can say yup.string.required.max, then pass through here, for example, 200 as your maximum string length. So check the documentation for the yup package for more information, but essentially you can define whatever you want up here. Okay, so that is basically how it's going to work. And now once you're done and you have everything validated, let's go down here now, and we can say, for example, something simple like a switch statement. We can say switch, we can say data.event. So down here we know everything's safe. We have the event, the payload, the x and y. So we can say here switch data.event, and we can say, for example, case post comment. Okay, we can say something like, oh sorry, my mistake, it's going to be case player movement. Okay, so case player movement. We can say, for example, console.log, okay, received player movement. Something like that. So now inside here you have the X, you have the Y, and everything's all good. So that right there is one way of validating and, creating restrictions on your JSON data coming through, so you can work with it correctly. There are many different techniques online, like I said, but this is just my implementation. So of course you can expand on this. You can possibly even put your callback function on this object right here to say, for example, you can define a function inside here which runs once you receive a player movement event. It's totally up to you, whichever works best for your own application. Okay, and that is how to validate and parse and create schemas for your JSON data when sending them through WebSockets. Now, I do want to mention one more thing, and that is when it comes to the client side, you don't need to go into this much detail for validation, okay? Because the client is going to be receiving data from the server. So essentially, your server should always be sending through the correct data. So, maybe in the index HTML, if the client side received an event for player movement from the server, you sort of know already it's going to have an X and Y, and you know what the data format is going to be in. Okay, because the server is not going to send through bad data. The server should always send through correct data. So there should be no need for anything like this. You can of course follow the same format where you say event and payload, but you don't need to actually validate the payload as often, if not at all. So just keep that in mind. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you later.